Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Thank you so very much for joining us today. And if you're listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms, you know, you can always check out what's happening in studio by checking out our YouTube channel. If you're watching us on that YouTube channel, you know, you can take the Lunch Hour anywhere you want to go on one of the many fine podcast platforms. Pretty much wherever you get your podcast content, you can find the Lunch Hour. Please subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, and let your friends and family members' friends know all about how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour. I am incredibly excited to bring our guest on today. I had a wonderful opportunity to sit down with him. He was a very gracious host to me when I was in London a few weeks ago. His name is Fred de Fossard. Did I get that right, Fred? Good. He is the director of strategy with the Prosperity Institute, which is a free market limited government think tank in the UK. We're going to talk to him about what Prosperity does. He leads the Institute's parliamentary and legislative work. Normally, Fred, I edit these bios. I'm going to read yours entirely because as I said to you, I enjoy it so much. He is responsible for research on British prosperity, encompassing Brexit opportunities, regulatory and government reform, and economic growth. This includes a long-term legislative agenda required to return the UK to growth, aided by his expertise in parliamentary and constitutional affairs. Before working at Prosperity, he served as a special advisor to the Right Honorable Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, MP, between 2020 and 2022, as Leader of the House, Brexit Opportunities Minister, and Business Secretary, gaining a deep understanding of the mechanics of the British state and how it needs to be reformed. He helped deliver a host of regulatory reforms related to Brexit, policies to improve civil service recruitment, and helped manage the government's legislative program. While working for the political consultancy Public First from 2018 to 2020, he developed a Europe-wide campaign for better regulation in the tech sector and traveled the country to understand public attitudes towards house building. He read history at Magdalen College, Oxford, and takes a keen interest in medieval English history. And before working in politics, he was a chef. I am absolutely going to ask you about that, Fred. Listen, let's jump in here. So are we now almost at the 10th anniversary of Brexit?
We are coming up to the 9th anniversary of the referendum. The referendum was 23rd of June, 2016.
All right, yeah, you know something, that's right, because that was, I think, the first sort of heralding of the change was afoot, that real change was afoot. I mean, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, I mean, how are things going with it? Brexit, to me, presented tremendous opportunity, as I know you agree with me on this. Let's talk about sort of the opportunities. Let's also talk a little bit about what led up to it 9 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So Britain voted to leave in 2016. This was a very long time coming. The Conservative Party won a general election in 2015, and one of the most important policies in their manifesto was to hold a referendum following a renegotiation of our membership with the European Union. To be clear, if the Conservatives did not put this referendum policy in their manifesto, they would not have won the general election. It was absolutely essential for holding together as critical mass of right-wing voters in Britain to get the Conservatives over the line. But of course, the Brexity sentiment dated back to the 1990s on the British right, into the 80s, into the 70s on the British left. There was always concern about Britain's relationship with the European Union because we were surrendering lawmaking ability to a foreign body. That's ultimately the core of it. Where this became a headline political issue was immigration.
Right. Well, let's get to immigration in a second. But I guess I never realized. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was warning about the EU, you know, many, many years ago as a conservative. We all know how the British left and the British press and the British mainstream media viewed Thatcher. And I'm a huge Margaret Thatcher fan. I didn't realize that there was even a tradition on the left, or at least a position on the left that was anti-Brexit. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Britain joined the European Union formally in 1972, and then there was a referendum again to reaffirm our membership of it. But the first pro-Europeans in British politics were actually Conservatives in the 1950s. These were people like Harold Macmillan and
Mm,
and then Ted Heath in the 1970s. There was this idea that the European coal and steel community, then the European Common Market, as it developed in its name, represented a form of sort of economic progress and unification after incredibly violent 30, 40 years in European history. Interestingly, the European Union was held up as an organization which would be good for free trade, good for
mm,
market economics, and very importantly, would challenge some of the aggressive socialist economics, particularly put forward by the British Labour Party in the 1950s. So the trade union movement in Britain felt that the European Union was the boss's club. Essentially,
sure.
it was an anti-democratic group of countries which are generally trying to pursue slightly more market-led policies. Obviously, put into context that France was not a free market country compared to Britain and everything. Everything has its necessary context. But that was kind of the dynamic. The reason why this changed was kind of the domestic success of Margaret Thatcher. She won
Mm,
3 elections on the trot, 1979, 1982, and 1987. And in this period, the Labour Party went from being a Eurosceptic party to a pro-European party. 2 reasons here. One, they went from disliking the anti-democratic nature of the European Union to liking the
sure.
anti-democratic nature of the European Union because the British people kept on voting Conservative, and the Labour Party just kept on losing. And the other reason is around the late 80s and early 90s, the European Union started to change its character.
Right.
It became far more about regulatory harmonization, imposing rules and regulations that the entirety of the European Union has to follow. And they started doing more lawmaking, more regulation. And that emphasized to British voters, particularly British conservatives, that British law was subordinate to European law. And that's how things changed. Margaret Thatcher had her famous line, "We did not roll back the frontiers of the state in Britain only to see them reimposed upon us at the Brussels level."
Yeah.
Well, clearly, the Labour Party, by the time the 1990s rolled around, wanted the state to come back and realised that membership of the European Union was a way of doing that.
Now, I'm going to make the prosecutor's mistake of asking a question that I actually don't know the answer to. Was there any lurching? Was any of the lurch leftward at the EU level driven by the not just the collapse of Soviet or communist Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and then the not infiltration, but the inculcation of a lot of quasi-socialist values into EU policy as a result of all of these other countries getting absorbed? Or are they just two coincidental situations?
They happen slightly separately. So the European
Okay.
Union was well on its path to sort of
Of course, yeah.
social democracy regulation by the time all the Eastern European countries joined. So Berlin Wall comes down in 1989. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992 is the famous moment when the European single market is created. And this is what essentially turns the European Union from a collection of allied nations who ran their own affairs into a regulatory bloc where they dispensed with mutual recognition and went for harmonization. Britain always wanted mutual recognition because I think, and I think you would probably think as an American as well with a similar kind of tradition, if you have a trade relationship within countries and nations that you trust, mutual recognition is really good because it provides competition, you're working on a similar basis, but you're enabling a little bit of experimentation. The European Union, which was driven particularly by French attitude here, very top down, very process heavy, wanted to get rid of mutual recognition and replace it with harmonization.
Right.
That is when the British right really started turning against the EU.
It's so funny because having toiled in the fields of regulation for so long, anytime somebody was starting to talk about global harmonization, American companies, I'm sorry, not American companies, but companies in the United States that were doing business in Europe and probably were headquartered in Europe, I always knew that this was a problem. Let's talk, we'll come back to immigration in a second because I want to talk about this. But I want to talk about the rise of regulatory costs. And because this is one of the things that I talked about as driving Brexit, I used the now infamous example of olive oil and olive oil regulations. Are you familiar with this?
Please
That
tell me.
that the EU put out a mandate that said if you could no longer serve olive oil from a if you served olive oil on the table as a dip for bread, you had to pour it directly from the jar that it came, or the can that it came from, the bottle it came from. You couldn't decant it into something else. I mean, it was a very granular regulation, and it was designed obviously to protect certain aspects of the olive oil trade. They didn't want cut olive oil. I mean, listen, to me, I know, and you as a former chef know, when olive oil is either bad olive oil or cut olive oil. I have a restaurant in the town where I live where I know that they are basically, I no longer ask for olive oil on the table there because I know that it's just, vegetable oil that they've dropped a few droppers of good olive oil into to turn it slightly green. But I mean, that's the sort of the granular level that the EU regulatory bodies were going for.
Yeah.
This should teach us a lesson in the United States in terms of maybe, just maybe, you should be aware of why folks are going to rebel against the state. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Fred.
No, absolutely. I will. I now have heard that olive oil story, and it's a good reminder because it shows you the EU philosophy, which is they like process-based regulation. You must do this. You must do this. You must do this. You must do this. You must tick all these boxes. Whereas, from what I gather, America, but particularly Britain, before we joined the European Union, we preferred outcomes-based regulation.
Right.
Because if you have a good outcomes-based regulation and you can prove someone did you harm in the courts, there's a liability attached to that, but it allows for way more experimentation in how you get to the end point. And that allows for greater innovation, greater competition, greater efficiency, whereas the European Union model, in all manner of things, from data, digital services, chemicals regulations, agriculture, food regulations, product safety, takes the box-ticking approach. Right. And that means it damages competition, it damages innovation.
As well as, we just had a conversation with Adam Thier. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a scholar at the R Street Institute in Washington, D.C., and we were talking about permissionless innovation and the idea of the precautionary principle. I mean, here's a weird question. Again, getting to your philosophical side of things, because as you said, this gets driven by a French approach to the law, which is very different than the, Anglo-American approach. And I'm going to say the Anglo approach to law and reason. The one state in the United States that still has its laws based in the Napoleonic Code is Louisiana. And you can see the problems there. If you look at post-colonial Africa, nations that were reliant, that were French colonies, had all kinds of chaos ensue, whereas former English colonies were relatively stable. I mean, how much of this is rooted in the sort of I'm going to say backwards approach that the French have to, sort of law and society?
So I'll say this as a great Francophile. You might have noticed I do have a French surname.
Yes, of course.
And I think there are many things that, Britain and France are this sort of cousin nations to each other.
Of course.
There are a huge number of similarities about the two countries, particularly between northern France and Britain. But the differences are also ancient. We're rivals in many respects. And the differences in approach to regulation come down to a difference in approach to kingship, which goes back 1,000 years and even more. And we had this unique English innovation of the common law, which began with Alfred the Great in the end of the 9th century, which was a much more bottom-up, precedent-based approach to law, whereas the French maintained a much more Roman inherited type of lawmaking, which was about codes, which was much more prescriptive. And you could see it how
amazing.
Yeah.
And no, honestly, I mean, listen, I'm sorry, Fred, let me interrupt. I mean, this is why I so much enjoyed our meeting a couple of weeks ago, and why I'm so glad you came on, because this is important stuff. Folks, I will tell you something real quick, Fred. I'm going to sort of put in a plug for visiting the UK. I'd never been to the UK before, spent a glorious week there, but the time I spent going over history, and I'm a history buff, American history and, other places as well, but thinking deeply about things like natural law and what King Alfred did, and sort of going back and going through periods of revolution, and then going and logged a little bit of time last night looking about, at the sort of an overview of the Middle Ages and talking about this, but the idea of the sort of the parallel tracks and how they can produce such vastly different outcomes. This is important stuff. Again, talking about a precedential approach to this. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. You were saying.
No, it's really interesting how it manifests a very different approach. Now, obviously, there can be slight dangers to the precedential approach, because one thing that Britain and America both share is an issue with lawfare, is an issue with judicial review, is an issue with judicial activism, where obviously judgment creates another precedent. But then the great advantage that we have in Britain, basically uniquely in the entire developed world, is parliamentary sovereignty. Worth remembering, while we do have a Supreme Court, the Supreme Court in very few cases basically cannot overrule Parliament. So if there's a bad judgment at the Supreme Court, the next day, Parliament could pass a new law to strike down that judgment. And that's a really important, it's great, it's a really useful part of our Constitution, and it's our traditional rule of law, which is Parliament is supreme. And it means that you have a very clear distinction of the role of each thing, where judges and legislators and the executive, everything flows through the legislature.
This is a perfect segue because it then gets into the one thing that, sorry, I'm trying to figure out the most diplomatic way to word this. In order for that kind of a parliamentary system to work and to ensure that the rights of individuals are not abused and government doesn't expand too quickly, is you have to have a population that is invested in that history and tradition. And when that national character changes because, of unrestricted migration from areas of Europe or elsewhere that don't have this tradition, there's a real problem there. And that gets into the immigration issue and how that was affecting or how that was pushing the Brexit issue, right? Am I, first of all, I could be completely off base here and you can tell me to go stuff it, but you want to get your thoughts here on this.
No, I think you're pretty much right. What I will say is two things to add to that is our membership of the European Union had a couple of effects. One is free movement of people, so you just couldn't control your borders. Britain's border was only as strong as the most liberal European country's border. So we had many cases where people who Britain denied a visa to moved to Germany, got German residency, then moved to Britain under European Freedom of Movement Act. We didn't do anything about that. So there's that angle. But on your point about the constitutional rights and liberties and definition of the state issue, because Britain has an unwritten constitution, our constitution is essentially made up of hundreds of individual documents and precedents going back 1,000 years. It's not like America, where you have quite clearly set out safeguards. Like for example, your executive agencies obviously have been pretty bad and have done wild things, but there are constitutional limits to them.
Right.
We don't quite have that same thing. So we had this ability for the state to be quite authoritarian, combined with greater European Union supremacy over regulatory policy, and then the issue of immigration. And you have this wild combination of issues where the country went from being one of the most stable, demographically homogenous countries in the developed world in a very, very rapid period of time to then become a multicultural one. And this was not really something that the British people asked for. This came from migration from the former colonies, so the Caribbean, India, Pakistan are the most notable ones. But then immigration was pretty low from the 1970s until all the way till 2000. Immigration was a hot button issue in the 60s and the 70s. Then under Margaret Thatcher, the immigration was really, really limited. It was probably about maybe 10, 20,000 people a year on net, and many years net emigration, because British people actually moved to the United States, interestingly. Wow. Quite a few to Australia, but loads to America. And then all this changed from 1997 when Labour came into power. And they massively liberalised immigration in all forms. So yes, it increased massively from the rest of the world, but from 2005 onwards, it really increased massively from the European Union. And then the really poor former Soviet countries joined the EU. So not just Poland, but then sort of Romania, Bulgaria, and huge, huge numbers of people turned up. And at one point, the British government estimated that only 10,000 Polish people will arrive. So therefore, we don't need to worry about putting transitional controls on the number of Polish people coming over. And those numbers were completely out of line. Turns out hundreds of thousands, or possibly even low millions of people arrived.
Wow.
Completely blowing numbers out of the water. And also basically the population's ability to cope, because this was so rapid, such an overwhelming change, and something obviously no British electorate has ever voted for.
Well, this gets into, again, the parallel struggles that we have, because this was a huge issue. Obviously, it was a huge issue over the last 4 years, and a huge issue in terms of these communities. It's funny because, President Trump, when he was running for re-election, talked about this town in Ohio. As it happened at the same time, I have family from the Midwest, from the state of Indiana, and the town that my grandmother's family is from, Logansport, Indiana, was struggling. And it wasn't, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. It was, we have X number of people coming in. We don't have the staff. Our schools are being taxed in this. And, obviously there's some folks who are going to call this xenophobia. I have a statement. I may have said this to you in our meeting. I think I did. The most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. Right. And maybe, listen, we want to be wonderful people and open people and loving people in terms of letting people into our communities and letting people come and settle. But at some point in time, we can't do this without an impact. And that's what Britain was faced with, wasn't it?
Yeah, and also you get these competing rights issues. I mean, I'm a conservative with a small c and also a big C. I'm a member of the Conservative Party, but I do definitely come from the libertarian tradition in the Conservative Party, the much more sort of Thatcherite free market. But you see this really interesting tension where your libertarian approach butts up against what someone else's libertarian approach, because someone's belief to pursue their life in a new country butts up against the willingness of someone in that country already to pursue their life as they see fit. And ultimately, government policy should act in the best interest of the people already in the country, not the newcomers. Because ultimately, the people who vote for the government are the ones already in this country. And this is kind of what was happening when it came to the referendum. So we had hundreds of thousands of people coming into this country. And this was partly motivated by large numbers of people coming from the really poor parts of Europe, but also the Euro crisis, because youth unemployment in Italy, Spain, Greece was appalling. And basically loads and loads of people moved here. And obviously the integration issues of Italians and Spaniards and Greeks has been very minor, but it's very different to some people from different parts of Eastern Europe, and they happen to move to poorer areas, and there were just a lot more tensions. But then, of course, the most controversial kind of immigration, I suppose, is not actually related to the European Union. It's still migration from South Asia and Africa. But in the end, the vote to leave in 2016 should be considered a sort of proxy vote for all these things together, because it was basically the first time the British public had the ability to, or given the signal from the state, to, have a vote on this massive single constitutional political issue. And the big slogan that Vote Leave had was "Take Back Control." And that spoke to a rage about, regulation and taxation and economic policy and sovereignty, but it also spoke to a rage, a really important rage, about lack of control over immigration policy, borders, who can come into your own country, why is the state failing to look after its basic principles? And surely border control is a fundamental basic principle of any nation state.
So let's talk about the opportunities there and what's been successful and what the challenges are moving forward. Because again, we just had our election. We are, as we're recording this, we are 50, 60 days into the new administration. Obviously, lots of changes and upheaval. But let's talk about the things get implemented and the opportunities that were there for fundamental, I'm not going to say fundamental change, but let's just say a reestablishment and a resurgence of British sovereignty. What were the focuses and what are the challenges that remain?
Absolutely right. Great question. So we voted to leave 9 years ago. We have been officially out of the European Union for 4 years.
Wow.
In that time, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has come into force. That is the name of the trade deal between Britain and Europe. It is the most comprehensive trade deal that the European Union has ever signed. So it's a tariff-free and a quota-free trade deal between Britain and Europe. There are some issues around customs procedures, But overall, the main benefit is that this agreement has provided Britain the ability to do its own trade policy and its own regulatory policy. The fly in the ointment is that Northern Ireland hasn't fully been extricated from the EU. There were some legacy issues there which the previous government failed to deal with and this government aren't interested in solving, which is a great shame, but there's always more work to be done. In terms of what we've actually done since, the difficult thing is, and this is one of the reasons why the Conservatives lost the election, is they haven't done as much as they could have or should have. So there are some, I can talk to you about, some nice micro deregulations. It's great that we have things like gene editing, so we can use greater genetic modifications for growing crops, because that increases food productivity and security. It's great that we're diverging a little bit from GDPR, but not nearly enough. But overall, we're still kind of stuck in the same EU approach to regulation. So interestingly, the best things we've avoided have been the things that the EU have done. The EU has gone in a wildly regulatory direction since Britain left. The AI Act, the Digital Services Act, the Product Safety Directive and regulations, the Packaging Directive regulations, more green stuff, more wild energy stuff.
Right.
And so Britain, by default, is not affected by them. And
so it's so funny because I talk about an issue, I don't know if we talked about it in the meeting, but the regulatory glide path or the regulatory cost glide path, which is to say the economic benefits you get over time by not adding to your regulatory costs. So deregulation is great, but if you can simply go along and you don't have, the rise in regulatory costs, you're just sort of going along. And it's one of those things, right? If Donald Trump had stayed in office from 2021 to 2025, we wouldn't have had $2 trillion, nearly $2 trillion in regulatory costs added to the American economy, indirect costs. And the same thing, my numbers show that if we stayed on the Biden trajectory, regulatory costs will be in the United States at about $7 trillion, direct regulatory costs by 2030. Which is unsustainable. But so the benefits there, that's important. I mean, have you guys done any estimates as to the difference, the savings in
it's a great question. I haven't got you a figure yet, but I've been looking at some of the impact assessments that the EU has produced for its own new regulations. Unsurprisingly, the impact assessments are rubbish and do not give you a proper story. But they're adding hundreds of millions, billions and billions of euros of costs onto what they're doing. So take GDPR, because Americans know about GDPR. In order to comply with European regulations, you need data protection officers, you need all this transparency about the collection of data and privacy. Total insanity. They are now
every website I visited on my phone when I was in there, it's like, do you accept the cookies? Do you accept I'm like, yes. give me the website.
And the amount of friction it creates in your day-to-day use of online tech is insane. And so they now want to do the same for physical products. So there's product safety and the whole product safety supply chain. So if you want to sell something to Europe, so you might have, Andrew Langer Industries building widgets, which goes to a car, which then gets sold to Europe, you will have to provide a huge amount of safety certification and disclosure, even though you're making the little widget that goes into the car that's eventually sold to Europe. So they want total supply chain disclosure. And they think they can do another GDPR because you guys in America have complied with GDPR to an extent. Yeah. In reality, what they're going to do is just give everyone outside the European Union a reason not to bother selling to Europe.
Sure.
But at the same time, they're not going to do the sort of pro-competitive, deregulatory things domestically, like cut the cost of energy, to re-encourage industry in Europe. So it's just going to be this mess of greater regulation, greater cost.
No, it really is amazing. And the issue, I mean, as we talk about this of competition and trade and how these things go into it, I mean, there are so many instances. You would think that they would have learned the lesson, but I guess folks are, who knows? I mean, you're right. It's not like France or Spain is going to leave the EU anytime soon.
No, it's true, because I think that if you look at Britain's relationship with the EU, it was always very transactional. It was Britain's poor in the late 60s, early 70s. A way of improving our productivity would be to join the European Union. Then the European Union kind of goes sluggish. We do really well in the late 80s after the Nigel Lawson and Margaret Thatcher economic boom from deregulation. Then we start getting bit fed up with our relationship with the EU, and we were the second biggest contributor. That's very different to lots of European countries who have a much more philosophical attachment to the EU, because they look at it as an organisation which brought peace after the continent tore itself to pieces. Britain always had a democracy for a lot longer than the rest of Europe did. So we already had sort of peace domestically, so we didn't have that attachment. But one thing I want to talk about a little bit is trade, because this is going to be quite a relevant issue, because trade policy is now a proper Brexit freedom. We have signed new trade deals, better trade deals than when we were in the European Union. The CPTPP, the Comprehensive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever it's called. Britain has joined the CPTPP, the first non-Pacific country to join the CPTPP, originally called TPP when you guys were negotiating it. That is really important, because it starts putting us on a more deregulatory orbit outside the European Union, and then hopefully it pivots towards Britain doing a trade deal with the United States, which will be an amazing prize. And it does look like, even though we have a quite pro-EU government and a pro-EU Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he's met Trump multiple times, they've spoken multiple times, they're talking about a trade deal. So this is the thing we want to encourage them to do.
I know this isn't a trade piece, but if we could get the Diego Garcia thing solved, hopefully, again, as we talk about this, I want to talk about some of the other things you're working on. You had a piece from the fall about the post-woke capitalist milieu.
Yes.
I mean, talk about that, but about woke capitalism, because obviously big issue here in the States. But an even bigger issue in Great Britain.
So we wrote a paper in summer last year about woke capitalism. So you guys all know what that means. That's ESG, that's DEI, that's all the madness. And it's very entrenched in Britain. So while the vibe shift is underway in America, and it's underway sort of politically to an extent here, the problem we have is so much of this stuff is embedded in law. In British law, it takes the form of the Climate Change Act and net zero regulations, the Equality Act, which mandates all the DEI in the workplace, various employment regulations, which stifle free speech, and then lots of international treaties and organizations like the Net Zero Banking Alliance and all those kind of task forces. These are properly enmeshed in the British economy. And we've been campaigning on a few issues. One such was our financial services regulator, called the Financial Conduct Authority, wanted to impose diversity reporting requirements on private companies in the financial services sector. Completely insane. By their own admission, it would add £1 billion of costs to businesses, but they say, we need to do this because this is a good thing. So backlash begins, MPs kick off, there's letters, there's news articles, and then unexpectedly 2 weeks ago, they reversed and they said they're not going to do it because they've had negative feedback. So it's a tactical win, because the underlying basis for them doing it is still in law. There's lots of equality legislation. There's lots of all that kind of anti-meritocratic, sort of like affirmative action, which we call positive action. And so there's a lot more work to be done, and it's a long-term thing. We can't just sign executive orders to do everything.
It takes a process, and I know I sent you a piece about our Administrative Procedure Act. But let me ask you. You just said something really interesting, which is, the justification was, we know it's going to cost X, Y, and Z, but it's a good thing.
Oh yeah.
Are we starting to see less of that? I mean, are we going to return? I know here we're talking about it more, but in the UK, are you guys talking more about this idea of maybe having to justify through some kind of, show your work, as they my teachers used to say to me, that it is a good thing. Just because you say it's a good thing doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing. Are we seeing more of this? Please justify why it's a good thing or how it's a good thing.
That is a great question. I think there's a cluster of high quality right of centre MPs who are pushing these issues, and because you're an MP, you're elected, therefore you have a constitutional right to get more information out of these regulators, and you can scrutinise them a bit better with select committees and force them to say things. The Financial Conduct Authority said that we know groupthink's really bad. Groupthink is bad. We all agree with that. So they think that doing gender and racial diversity reporting requirements is a way of breaking out of groupthink, which is completely wrong because, as we know, what it is used is actually to entrench groupthink, but provide a
Absolutely,
sort of,
100%.
a diverse like whitewash to a
Right,
groupthink. So
right.
yeah, so that's where they are at the moment intellectually. So they're being forced on a journey. The British debate is so focused on the fiscal and monetary aspects of regulatory costs, but very narrow. So they like administrative costs and compliance
Sure.
costs. They don't look at the overall opportunity cost of the whole
Opportunity
economy.
cost, which is the problem that we have here at home, as we've talked about. And it's so funny because I went to a very progressive, I think I said this, my very progressive high school in New York, and they have gotten caught in it a number of times. This idea of racial affinity groups and how you go about. So yeah, these are all big things. Listen, we got a couple minutes left, and you've been very generous with your time. Let's start here because I think folks need to understand a little bit more about what the Prosperity Institute is, how long you've been around, the work that you guys do.
So this was initially founded in 2007 as the Legatum Institute. We worked on a number of things, notably trade policy, for quite a long time. Our flagship product was a thing called the Global Prosperity Index, which was inspired by the people that set up the Institute that thought, we've seen businesses grow and fall and succeed and die all over the world. There must be a public policy angle to this. Is there a secret source to what makes nations rich? And how can we use an institute to drive that way of thinking? And so that's the kind of abiding spirit in which the Institute has approached everything over the last 15 years or so. I have been here for 2 years working with the managing director, Radomir Tilko, and we were part of a group that renamed the Institute a couple of months ago to Prosperity because it clarifies our mission.
Absolutely.
Our logo had that fantastic golden archer who is firing the arrow of prosperity into the long distance. And that really shows our sort of motivation. And we're not party affiliated, but we are right of centre. We're very much a conservative philosophically think tank. We cover a mixture of economic, regulatory, constitutional, immigration policy. We do a wide range of policy.
Right.
And essentially what we're motivated to do is work out what are the great burning existential and civilizational problems facing Britain and the British people, and how do we solve it? And as you said in my biography earlier, it's constitutional reform, it's re-energizing British democracy, and it's liberating the British economy and the entrepreneurial spirit.
Amazing things that need to be happening here as well at home, and it was so good to be over there. So let's talk about this because I guess I missed this. So you were a chef. I'm an avid foodie, as I think you know. I do the bulk of the cooking here at home. I love culinary science. How did that come about? What did you have any particular specialties? Talk about this.
So politics and food have been my main love since I was a teenager. And I came to the end of my time at university. I studied at Oxford, read history, and I had been doing loads of fun things like running all the catering and the parties for our college. So I was doing things like hog roasts, garden parties, and so doing events for 200 people, that sort of thing. Really, really fun, and realized I'm enjoying this more than the idea of getting a normal job. I want to have a go at being a chef. So I wrote to my favorite restaurant in Oxford, which no longer exists, unfortunately, but it was called the Turl Street Kitchen. And I said to them, I've just finished my exams, would love to learn how to become a chef. Can you give me a job? And on I went. It was a wonderful learning experience. I wasn't there for very long, but then I moved back home to Somerset in the West Country and continued cooking for a couple of years. And I did a lot. I worked for a number of small restaurants, and we did the sort of food what we in England call nose to tail eating. So we buy whole animals in, whole pigs, whole sheep, and everything. Butcher up everything, cook all the wobbly bits, change the menu every day. That sort of cooking.
Listen, in America, we say we use everything except for the squeal when we're talking about the pig. So yeah, I've never done whole hog, which is what we call it here. When you smoke barbecue a whole hog. My brothers and I have done barbecue competitions, and it's actually kind of fun because I get very creative. I don't know if you're familiar with American barbecue competitions, but there's no real creativity that goes into it. It's something like I know where I want to do things, and I might want to put a little Asian flair on my thing. Yeah. But then I come to realize that really what you're doing is you are competing to get your ribs or your shoulder or your brisket or whatever to somebody's version of an ideal. And so you're all trying, it's like a competition to get as close to conformity as possible, which rubs me the wrong way, pun intended with the barbecue. But that is amazing to me. That's so much fun that you're doing that. And there's been, I think, a real resurgence in that idea of going, how did you say, snout to tail?
Nose to tail.
Nose to tail.
Yeah. It was kicked off by a brilliant British restaurateur called Fergus Henderson, who set up St. John Restaurant in London in the 1990s. And it's been percolating and brewing since then. He's gone back into the history books to dig up our medieval cooking tradition, our 18th and 19th century cooking tradition. I will say to your American audience, I feel that British food is incredibly underrated and has had a bad reputational few decades, mainly because of rationing in the Second World War. But it's going through a very good period now.
It's interesting you say that, because I got a lot of folks asking me about that when I got home from my trip. I'm like, no, I mean, I had one meal that I perhaps didn't quite like, and that was, it won't even get into it. But apart from that, I mean, some of it was I really went out of my way to find restaurants that I wanted to go to at places, and asked you guys for some great recommendations, and you came through. I will tell you something. I didn't even say this to you. We went out the evening after we met, and we were in the West End, and we were in Covent Gardens. How do you say it? It's so we were there and came out and smelled somebody roasting lamb.
Oh, good.
And I could not figure out where it was coming. It's all I wanted. All I wanted was, that was part of my goal over there, was to eat a Sunday roast.
Good.
Traditional Yorkshire pudding, and then I wanted to get my fill of lamb, because nobody else in my family eats lamb like in my home, and I love making it. So it was great. What do you, real quick before I let you go, what do you make? What's like your go-to? You're at home, you want to make something, whip up something for the family. What are you making?
So it is actually lamb. If I'm doing big cooking for the whole family, I'll cook a shoulder of lamb. In the springtime, I will make a pesto with wild garlic, because wild garlic in England is just absolutely wonderful. You go out into the woods, you pick handfuls of it from the woods, make a pesto with that. So wild garlic, olive oil, lemon juice, lots of salt, bash it all up, score the whole shoulder of lamb, rub the wild garlic in it, cover it in foil, put it in the oven for about 3 hours, take the foil off so it crisps up. And in the meantime, you make that amazing French potato dish, potato dauphinoise. Layered with cream and garlic. That's an all-timer.
There you go. Listen, you're making me hungry. We've been doing here a low carb diet, and so I've been getting creative with all of that. Listen, Fred de Fossard, thank you so very much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you very much for having me.
Our guest has been Fred de Fossard, I got that right? Director of Strategy for the Prosperity Institute. You can check them out. I'm sorry, Fred, the website. How do folks find out more about the work that you guys are doing?
Prosperity.com.
Prosperity.com. Simple and straightforward, and lucky for all of us that you were able to get that web address. Listen, this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. Check us out on our YouTube channel if you want to see what's happening in studio. If you're watching us, you can go and take us with you on one of the many fine podcast platforms. Basically, wherever you find your podcast content, you can find us there. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.